that men can admire, live among, and fancifully rearrange, but also human nature that is universal in certain fundamental ways. Social issues are also the subject matter of many poems whose interest is with the society and milieu in which they are located and from where they emanate. These poems normally adopt one of two stances. Firstly, the universalizing of a topic occurrence. Secondly, the particularizing of a universal phenomena, the subject matter of these poems in the environment we live in, social, political, economic, religious, etc. Romantic themes abound in poetry, and such poems are characterized by a sense of wonder, mystery, subjectivity, emotional involvement, infinity, and freedom. Romantic poems normally talk about nature, love, memories of the past, etc. A poetic description of this kind of poetry can be found in this section of T.S. Eliot's Preludes. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling to the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering things. A language is a system of verbal signs by means of which humans can communicate with one another. One of its outstanding features is that these signs have content, refers to the world of experience, and stand for things. Ordinarily, this is the feature of greatest use, and everyday language functions in the main as a way of transaction to pass something on from one person to the next. Its content is what matters. We must now think of language in poetry as having somehow escaped the servitude under which language toils in everyday life. It is as though language had long nourished an ambition to be itself the subject of the transaction rather than the means, as though somehow this were the goal which the inherent logic of its nature made desirable despite rather than the means, as though somehow the goal which the inherent logic of nature made desirable, despite the fact that by far the greatest portion of language, however is measured, continues without any appearance of strain to function referentially as indicated above. Poetry is language that asserts itself. Poetry is refractory, opaque, durable. Using materials from the verbal traffic of everyday life, poetry manages to secure for them exemption from the common fate of language. It is not even defeated by our lack of complete understanding. It prevents this easy transaction of perpetually withholding some indefinable remainder of its meaning, forcing us to come back to the language again and again. Having placed ourselves within the charmed circle, we can share in the feelings of achievement even though we are in some sense a victim. For language is a human achievement and poetry is language triumphant. Within brackets, Wheeler, 30 से 31, bracket close. Uh, our proposal is that you don't worry too much about correct and wrong definition or methods, but give yourself plenty of opportunities to discover for yourself what kind of poem you like and what you don't, and also take time to work out why. We also think you need to begin with models to work from and say what you want to say in whatever form you choose. Bierne, within brackets Bierne 2002 colon 108 bracket close. Let's write a poem. Step 1. Start with an idea, an object, an experience, a person, a memory, a phrase, an image, or even a word. What sort of poem will it be? Question mark. Long or short? Question mark. Lyric, narrative, or dramatic? Question mark. Sonnet, haiku, syllabic? Question mark. An experimental gamble? Question mark. Who are your readers? Question mark. Sometimes the of answer to these and other initial questions will not be visible at the beginning. You will find yourself working with and on the material before recognizing what shape the poem is going to take. Keep yourself open intellectually and emotionally. Step 2. Get your raw materials into some kind of temporary organization so that you can gamble, you can grapple with it. You have responded to the initial impulse prompted by what seeded the poem in you. Now you have to struggle to achieve a rough shape and sketchy sequence, even if these change completely later. Step 3. Write down your tentative lines and find words to express what you want to say and decide how you want to say it. How would you like to open? Directly, by indicating clearly what is to follow, obliquely, so that the reader is shocked or surprised later, dramatically, so that attention is drawn to your poem right at the outset, with an image that can be expanded or changed later, or casually or conversationally, so that you have the freedom to move in whatever direction the poem takes you. What kind of lines will you write in? Long or short or a combination of both? Question mark. How will you develop your theme? Through metaphors and other figures of speech, through language, or in some other way? How will your poem end? Question mark. Step 4. Read the poem to yourself. Does it have substance? Question mark. Does it have a shape that looks authentic enough? Question mark. Is there some kind of unity? Question mark. Does it make sense? Question mark. Does it seem to move logically to its ending? Question mark. You now have a full-fledged first draft. Step 5. Revise by yourself and discuss the poem in your group and then revise again. Keep doing this till it sounds right. Remember, a poem is many things at the same time: an expression of emotion, a felt experience, a performance, and a created illusion. How can these ineffable things be communicated? Question mark. Feeling by itself does not make a poem. A poem cannot be written without it, of course, but depth of emotion alone does not make a poem. Neither do craft and skills. You have already come equipped with feeling and sensitivity, and the skills you have acquired help you incorporate these into your poem. The tension in your poem will come from the conflicts of your created situation, event, whatever else you have decided as your vehicle. The dynamics will evolve from your progression, pacing, pattern development, and intensification. Tone and mood come from your word meanings, style of diction, assonance and dissonance. But finally, what counts is the effect of the poem as a whole. Riccio 1980 colon 209 slash dash 225 within brackets. The art of poetry does not come from skillfully putting words together to give information or express emotion. The art evolves from a skilled arrangement of language to realize its greatest power to use words in a manner and combination that have never been done before and yet seems so right. Happy writing. Workshop 1 Practice. Given below are the opening stanzas of two poems. Complete the poems using the same form as far as possible. Love poem. When I was 1 and 20, I heard an old man say, give crowns and pounds and juniors, but now your heart away. Now I am dash dash dash. Alive at 3 he was sober, at 6 he was drunk, a robber in a fantasy train. He went on dash 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 dash. Workshop 2 Share and learn. Read out the poem you composed in workshop 1 to the other members of your tutorial group who should respond with questions, comments, etc. Workshop 3 Create. Using one of the words given below, think of a possible poem. Keep the points given as step 3 of getting down to writing poetry in mind and discuss your idea with your group. Compose a poem for your portfolio. Dew chocolate, crimson photograph, love swim, silence. While you are reading through your draft, there are many things to think about. Here are some questions that may help you. Language. Point 1. Do you repeat some words too often? Point 2. Is any of the phrasing awkward? Question mark. Point 3. Are there too many overused adjectives? Um, Nice, lovely, beautiful, etc. Question mark. Point 4. Are you using clinches in bracket unoriginal phrases bracket close that could be changed? Question mark. Point 5. Are you using metaphors or similes? Question mark. Are there too many? Question mark. Point 6. Do your rhymes work well? Question mark. Are you using words just for the sake of rhyme? Question mark. Image. Are you painting a full picture for your reader? Question mark. Are your description too vague and unclear? Question mark. Structure. Do you have a good beginning, middle and end? Question mark. Does the opening grab your attention and make you want to go on? Question mark. Have you get the best possible opening line or stanza? Question mark. Rhythm. Do the words, phrases and lines flow? Question mark. How well does it read out loud? Question mark. Is the rhythm working well overall? Question mark. Do you keep the same rhythm throughout? Question mark. General. Point 1. Are your lines the right length? Question mark. Point 2. Should the poem be in a different form? Question mark. Is the poem too complicated? Question mark. Point 4. Is the title right? Question mark. Point 5. Point 5. Is the poem original in any way? Question mark. Point 6. Is there anything in the poem you don't need? Question mark. Does the poem do what you want it to do? Question mark. Will the poem make sense to the reader? Question mark. How will the reader respond to this? Question mark. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the poem? Question mark. The next step. How can it be improved? Question mark. What needs to be done next? Question mark. If you have gone through this checklist and you are not sure what needs to be done next, leave your poem for a while and come back to it later. Bierne 2002 118 within brackets. Section 2. Fiction. We have all enjoyed stories about human beings who will never meet in real life, about places that are not on the map, about animals who talk, about fairies and demons. Fiction, from the Latin fictio, a shaping, a counterfeiting, within brackets, is a name for stories not entirely factual but at least partially shaped, made up, imagined, within brackets Cadeny 1991 bracket close. However, fiction cannot be merely defined as a story that is not true. The relationship of fiction with real life events is not a straightforward one. It is not as though fiction has nothing to do with reality. People often exclaim after reading a good novel, "It is so lifelike," or they might complain after reading a bad story, "It doesn't work, it is not believable." Fiction needs to relate a real life, but not necessarily through facts. In fiction, the facts may or may not be true, and story is none the worse for their being entirely imaginary. We expect from fiction a sense of how people act, not an authentic chronicle of how, at some time, a few people acted. Ibid. As fiction is more about insight into life and events than about facts, works of fantasy are also classified under it. We read fiction both for pleasure and instruction, but the kind of instructions fiction imparts is different from that provided by books of history or sociology.
Writing 95. Non-fiction. There is a view that storytelling is as old as human communication. We relate to each other through stories. Stories about what happened to us and our loved ones this morn ing or years ago. What we hope and wish for. What we dread. Some people are better at making stories than others. Some stories, although interesting and enjoyable, may indeed be factual. In recent times, creative non-fiction has emerged as a separate category of creative writing. As the nomenclature suggests, it deals with real-life events narrated imaginatively. Frank McCourt's memoir Angela's Ashes, 1996, is an excellent example of what is meant by creative non-fiction. Frank McCourt was brought up in the slums of Limerick, Ireland. Frank's mother, Angela, has no money to feed the children since Frank's father Malachi rarely works, and when he does he drinks his wages. Yet Malachi does nurture in Frank an appetite for the one thing he can provide, a story. Perhaps it is a story that accounts for Frank's survival. Wearing shoes repaired with tires, begging a pig's head for Christmas dinner, and searching the pubs for his father, Frank endures poverty, near starvation and the casual cruelty of relatives and neighbors, yet lives to tell his tale with eloquence, exuberance and remarkable forgiveness, Blurb of Simon and Schuster edition. McCourt writes in Angela's Ashes, "When I look back on my childhood, I wonder how I managed to survive at all. It was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while. Worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood, and worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood." Truman Capote, the famous American writer, is credited with having invented the genre of creative nonfiction with his chilling nonfiction novel In Cold Blood, 1965. If all Truman Capote did was invent a new genre, journalism written with the language and structure of literature, this non-fiction novel about the brutal slaying of the Clutter family by two would-be robbers would be remembered as a trailblazing experiment that has influenced countless writers. But Capote achieved more than that. He wrote a true masterpiece of creative non-fiction. The images of this tale continue to resonate in our minds. 16-year-old Nancy Clutter teaching a friend how to bake a cherry pie, Dick Hickok's black 49 Chevrolet sedan, Perry Smith's Gibson guitar, and his dreams of gold in a tropical paradise, the blood on the walls, and the final thud snap of the rope broken next. One. Nonfiction is defined by its fidelity to facts. It may occasionally touch the borders of journalism. Fiction, on the other hand, is a looser category that embraces both facts and fiction. Many autobiographical novels that are based on facts, like the H. Lawrence Sons and Lovers, are classified under fiction. Unit 03A, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 95. 96 Creative Writing. Activity 14. 1. Describe the relationship between fact and fiction on the basis of a novel you have read. 2. Define creative nonfiction. With examples from a creative nonfiction text that you have read, describe the criteria that distinguish it from fiction. Fiction and the 20th century. Stories used to have a beginning, middle, and an end. Often there would be a moral to them. Generally, they had characters the reader could empathize with, and plots that were discernible. But that was earlier. Today, fiction is vast and complex. Some stories still look like this, but a lot of fiction poses a challenge to the reader's intellect. Thus, two rays of the progress of fiction worldwide are too many to be narrated here. But we can try to pick up some relevant episodes from its long and multitudinous history in English. In the realm of English fiction in the 18th century, we hear of two kinds of writing: romance, stories about the ideal, and realism, stories about life as it is. Romance, which was the older form and included both prose and verse narratives, sought to please the reader with tales of horror and adventure, with stories of far, far away and once upon a time, and later on with tales of love. It dealt with heroes and villains. Realism was concerned with social or historical change. So realistic fiction attempts to picture society as it is and human beings as they are. Gradually, realism came to be thought of as high art, and reading and writing of romance came to be considered low. We will discuss this distinction further in the present day categorization of fiction as literary and popular. By the 19th century, realism was established as the mode associated with the novel. In the 20th century, the two world wars, emergence of new nations, scientific and technological advancement, and radical experimentation in the arts brought about radical changes in the English novel. With modernist experimentations, between 1900 and 1940, the territory of fiction expanded considerably. Of course, the process of change had started even earlier. Challenges had begun coming into the hegemony of realism by the end of the 19th century. One of them was Impressionism. The term Impressionism is associated more with painting. It may be explained as a style in painting. developed in France in the late 19th century that uses color to show the effects of light on things and to suggest atmosphere rather than showing exact details. Impressionistic literature can basically be defined as when an author centers his story attention on the character's mental life, such as the character's impressions, feelings, sensations, and emotions, rather than trying to interpret them. Realistic fiction would describe the appearance and thought process of the characters with great authority. Such details were left out or left to the imagination of the reader in impressionistic fiction. Thus, suggesting rather than telling was the order of the day as far as literary impressionism is concerned. Unit 03A Creative Writing 728/2008 pm page 96. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 97. Celebrated novelists of this period are supposed to have been influenced by Impressionistic painters. Joseph Conrad's novels Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim, written in the early 20th century, show the influence of the painter Turner. Cezanne, another Impressionist painter, influenced Ernest Hemingway, the author of A Farewell to Arms and For Whom the Bell Tolls. Modernist literature also owes a lot to developments in psychology. Sigmund Freud changed the way people think about the human mind. Freud brought in the concept of the unconscious mind and established the fact that the individual is not always in complete control of his or her thoughts and desires. Modernist fiction expressed internal conflict of individuals. A good example is Stream of Consciousness, writing where one thought or word would lead to the next. In Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and James Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man, the subjectivity of the individual is being tapped without any consideration to the beginning, middle, or end of the story. After 1941 and especially after World War II in 1945, the individual becomes redundant in postmodern fiction. Internal conflict began to be avoided in favor of a more complex consciousness. The tortured, isolated anti-heroes of the modernists make way in postmodern writing for the self-consciously deconstructed and self-reflexive narrators of novels by Vladimir Nabokov, John Fowles, John Burt, Julian Barnes or Salman Rushdie. In Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, the protagonist is by no means like any human being we know. He is at best a collection of fragments. The importance of history. If we were to pick up a 19th century realistic novel like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and contrast it with a contemporary postmodernist novel like Toni Morrison's Beloved, we will see a difference not only in the concerns of the story but also a marked evolution in the way it is told. We would have to work much harder to understand the latter, and it is entirely possible that we may find the reading of it far more rewarding. Are we saying that Austen is irrelevant to a student who is trying to write in the present time? Sociopolitical factors determine the way we tell stories, and Morrison's world is necessarily more complex than Austen's. But Jane Austen has definitely not become irrelevant, as is evident from her presence not only in English literature syllabi but also in popular cinema. In fact, both romances of the 18th century and realistic novels of the 19th are extremely popular even today. For instance, Indian writers of realistic fiction, like Vikram Seth, have acknowledged the influence of 19th century masters on their work. When we teach ourselves how to write fiction, it would be helpful to keep the history of fiction down to the present time in our minds and read as much as we can from both contemporary and earlier works. We may get our inspiration from any period, and our writing will only be enriched if we know what has been attempted before. We give below, box 3.6, a list to, by no means exhaustive, of the possible types of novels that have been written. 2. Adapted and modified from A Little Bit About Novels by Rainey Goodwin. Unit 03A. Creative Writing 728/2008 pm page 97. 98 Creative Writing. Box 3.5. 3.5 Types of novels. Realistic novel, a fictional attempt to give the effect of reality. A realistic novel can be characterized by its complex characters with mixed motives that are rooted in social class and operate according to a highly developed social structure. The characters in a realistic novel interact with other characters and undergo plausible and everyday experiences. For example, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice deals with the manners and morals of 19th century landed gentry. Prose romance. This is a novel that is often set in the historical past with a plot that emphasizes adventure and an atmosphere that is removed from reality. The characters in a prose romance are sharply drawn as villains or heroes, masters or victims, while the protagonist is solitary and isolated from society. For example, Charlotte Bronte's classic romance novel Jane Eyre. The story is that of a governess, Jane Eyre. Despite her plainness, she captures the heart of her enigmatic employer, Edward Rochester, but soon discovers he has a secret that could jeopardize any hope of happiness between them. Novel of incident. In a novel of incident, the narrative focuses on what the protagonist will do next and how the story will turn out. Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express, where the detective Hercule Poirot investigates the mysterious murder of a passenger, is typical of the genre. Novel of character. A novel of character focuses on the protagonist's motives for what he/she does and how he/she will turn out. For example, Henry James's Portrait of a Lady is the story of a spirited young American woman, Isabel Archer, who affronts her destiny and finds it overwhelming. Epistolary novel. This first-person narrative progresses in the form of letters, journals, or diaries. For example, Jean Webster's Daddy Long Legs, where a young orphan being sponsored by a mysterious benefactor writes letters to him, telling him about her life. Picaresque novel. A picaresque novel relates the adventures of an eccentric or disreputable hero in episodic form. For example, Daniel Defoe's The Fortunes and Misfortunes of the Famous Moll Flanders, in which Moll Flanders is a successful thief. Historical novel. A historical novel is a novel set in a period earlier than that of the writing. For example, Paul Scott's Jewel in the Crown, published in 1966, is set in pre-independence India and evokes the atmosphere of the Raj. Regional novel. A regional novel is a novel that is set against the background of a particular area. For example, Thomas Hardy's Return of the Native is set mainly in the semi-imaginary county of Wessex, which is based on the English county of Essex. Non-fictional novel. This type of novel depicts living people and recent events fictionalized in the form of a story. For example, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, Gaunt. Unit 03A, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 98. Literary and Popular Fiction. The discussion above about literary impressionism, modernism and postmodernism, and most of the examples cited pertain basically to what publishers would call literary fiction. Romance, on the other hand, would be classified under popular fiction. The publishing industry worldwide makes a distinction between literary fiction and popular or commercial fiction. The modern literary story and novel may be abstract and difficult to figure out, but popular fiction works differently. Anne Maxwell and Elizabeth Lowell observe. In popular fiction, the only critics who really matter are the readers who pay money to buy books of their own choice. Reviews are irrelevant to sales. Readers of popular fiction judge an author by his or her ability to make the common language uncommonly meaningful, and to make an often told tale freshly exciting. The amount of Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 99. Bildungsroman, German term that indicates a novel of growth. This fictional biography is concerned with the development of the protagonist's mind, spirit, and character from childhood to adulthood. For example, Charles Dickens's eponymous novel David Copperfield. Roman A. This French term that refers to a social novel that has an argument, social, or political message. For example, in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the two central themes are the moral redemption of its main character, Jean Valjean, an ex-convict, and the moral redemption of a nation, France, through revolution. Roman a clef French term for a novel with a key, imaginary events with real people disguised as fictional characters. E.g. Shashi Tharoor's great Indian novel is a reinterpretation of the Mahabharata framed in India's struggle for independence and the political aftermath of colonization, where well-known contemporary personages make their appearances under altered names. Romanflu French term for a narrative that has a common theme or range of characters that stretch across a number of novels. For example, P.G. Wodehouse Jeeves series. Graphic novel. A graphic novel is a long-form work in the comics style, usually with a lengthy and complex storyline, and often aimed at mature audiences. This is a recent form, a little over 25 years old. It is becoming popular in India, and Sanath Banerjee's Corridor is credited with being the first Indian graphic novel. Activity 15. 1. Consult an encyclopedia and write a paragraph on Impressionistic art. 2. Make a list of 10 modernist and postmodernist novels giving their years of publication. 3. Find a definition of realism from a literary encyclopedia and make a list of 5 Indian novels written between 1947 to 006 that fit the bill. Unit 03A, Creative Writing 728/2008 pm page 99. 100 Creative Writing. Effort a reader puts into this fiction is minimal. That, after all, is the whole point, to entertain readers rather than to exercise them. The writers complain in the same article. Through the years I have discovered that most publishers talk highly of literary fiction and make money on popular fiction, yet asking them to describe the difference between literary and popular fiction is like asking when white becomes grey becomes black. Publishers may be forgiven for not being able to articulate it, as the difference between literary and popular would run into many tomes of theory. We too will not spend too much time in trying to distinguish between what are basically fluid categories. Popular and literary overlap and intermix. A popular text may well elbow its way into the literary category. Jules Verne's work is a classic example. A literary text may be a bestseller, Toni Morrison's beloved. Yet the distinction is worth making, if only to remind us that there can be no fixed rules for fiction. Popular literature needs to sell. When publishers package texts as popular, they have the market in mind. The following have a vibrant market. Popular romance, love stories. Like Mills and Boon. Chick lit emerged as a distinct genre in the 1990s with the publication of Helen Field Ing's Bridget Jones' Diary, about young women in metropolitan settings, airy and irreverent in tone. Science fiction, usually futuristic, called sci-fi, inspired by science and technological advancements, like Art Clarke's novels. Writing for children, like the Harry Potter series. Thrillers, novels with action heroes, like the James Bond series. Detective fiction, crime stories with detectives who solve the mystery, sometimes called whodunits, like Agatha Christie's novels. The sales of such books, even without the help of positive critical reviews, are astronomical. Gone with the Wind, published in 1936, is a good example. This mother of all modern romances, often derided for its unremarkable prose by the literary establishment, had sold 28 million copies by 1993. Some critics call popular fiction formula fiction or genre fiction, although writers and publishers hotly deny that there can be a formula to popular fiction. In our view, formula is indeed central to popular fiction, as is the related concept of the target readership. For example, romance, formula, boy meets girl, there are problems, problems are resolved through true love, is targeted for women. In the USA, you don't have to go to a bookstore to buy romances. The superstore from where housewives pick up grocery would stock romances. In our country, the market for popular fiction in English is still untapped. However, a new book by Shobhati is likely to be sold with magazines like The Cosmopolitan at traffic lights, unlike books by Salman Rushdie or Amitav Ghosh. That would be packaged far more gravely. We must not make the mistake of underestimating the importance of popular fiction. The sheer number of readers popular fiction attracts makes it a significant. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 pm, page 100. Unit 3, Modes of Creative Writing 101. Marker of culture. Also, to new writers, it is heartening to note that there is a place for all kinds of writing. The student would have to discover his/her potential. The student may go on to write highly abstract stories, realistic stories, or detective stories, sci fi, crime fiction, or romance. There is also a chance that the student might write something in between, a literary detective story, for instance. Hard work and insights into characterization, plot, milieu, setting, etc., would be required for all kinds of writing. Activity 16. 1. Try to find Indian examples of popular romance, detective fiction, spy thriller, science fiction, and children's fiction. 2. Read and discuss a work of popular fiction. The short story and the novel. There are many types of fiction. We have all heard of the novel and the short story, the former being long, the latter short. The difference between the two forms has been the origin, and we will deal with it later. Various sources identify other intermediate and extreme types, based on length. Times epic, a work of 200,000 words or more. Times novel, a work of 60,000 words or more. Times novella, a work of at least 17,500 words but under 60,000 words. Times novelette, a work of at least 7,500 words but under 17,500 words. Times short story, a work of at least 2,000 words but under 7,500 words. 1,000 words minimum by some definitions. Times flash fiction, a work of less than 2,000 words. 1,000 by some definitions. Some may complain that differentiating between forms like novella and novelette or flash fiction and short story would be to indulge in making distinctions without difference, and that the epic is a misnomer where bestsellers like The World According to Garp, John Irving, are meant. But the classification is useful for new writers who are trying to decide the ideal length of their fictions or for those who are looking for publishing avenues. The difference between short stories and novels is not only about the number of words. The stylish works of Chekhov, Joyce, Hemingway, Faulkner, etc. have given a distinct identity to the short story. The short story today is a sophisticated literary form that, according to Tobias Wolff, invites passion and reverence from the reader. Moreover, Wolff observes, but beyond passion, beyond reverence, there is a certain tone we use in discussing short stories that we do not use about novels. It is a tone close to that of shared confidence, even occasionally confession, as if the moments we recall from certain stories arise from our own experience. And that may be the particular power of the short story, the way it imitates memory. On Writing Short Stories, Ed Tom Bailey. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 pm, page 101. 102, Creative Writing. V.S. Pritchett, as quoted by Francine Prose in her article, What Makes a Short Story, in the same book, gives an elegant and incisive formulation. The novel tends to tell us everything, whereas the short story tells us only one thing, and that intensely. It is, as some have said, a glimpse through, resembling a painting or even a song which we can take in at once, yet bring the recesses and contours of larger experience to the mind. The analogy with painting is a good one and we can stay with it. Just as we take in a painting all together with our eyes, similarly the mind takes in a short story all together in one sitting. Although novels too have been compared to paintings, the portrait of the artist as a young man by James Joyce and Henry James's portrait of a lady, the analogy for obvious reasons works much better for the short story. Using a term Impressionism common to painting and literature, Susan C. Ferguson, in her article, Defining the Short Story, goes into the similarities and differences between the short story and the novel. Ferguson observes that although the main formal characteristics of the modern novel and the modern short story are the same, the modern short story is even more heavily influenced by turn of the century Impressionism than the novel. The most dramatic innovation is in the plot where the traditional beginning, middle and end is rejected by short story writers in favor of suggestion. Thus, if we complain that the modern novel is abstract, then the short story will be even more so. The readers have to exercise their intellect and make use of past experience of reading fiction to understand contemporary stories. The readers cannot rely any more on a narrator who will tell them everything and also underline the message of the story. The modern short story will usually limit itself to a single points of view, tell only some things and not necessarily in order, keep back others, leaving the reader to figure out the message if any. Figuring out a modern novel can be a lot of work too. But again, because of the size, the kind of challenge and excitement that the novel poses to the reader is likely to be qualitatively different from that of the short story. In the modern novel, we move from epiphany to epiphany, or in Woolf's image, along a series of small revelations, matches struck unexpectedly in the dark. In the short story, we frequently see only one such privileged moment which takes the place of the traditional turning point, the climax of the plot, Ferguson 1988. The single effect that the story wreaks is inevitable because of its shortness. In the space of less than 7,500 words, the writer would have to be very discerning about what to include. Unlike most novels, great short stories make us marvel at their integrity, their economy. If we went at them with our blue pencils, we might find we had nothing to do. We would discover there was nothing that the story could afford to lose without the whole delicate structure collapsing like a souffle or meringue. And yet we are left with a feeling of completeness, a conviction that we know exactly as much as we need to know, that all our questions have been answered, even if we are unable to formulate what exactly those questions and answers are. Prose ibid. Thus, far from being an unfinished novel, the short story is a complete whole. It is highly polished. It makes an intense and immediate connection with the reader. In the present Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 102. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 103. Asterisk Vilas Sarang, Notes of a Working Writer, The Women in Cages, Delhi, Penguin Books, 2006, pp 27783. Gaunt. Box 3.6, The Long and the Short asterisk. It's curious in English, the short story as a form is scarcely taken note of, is seen as marginal. In the Indian languages, on the other hand, short fiction is taken seriously, on par with the novel. Many prominent Indian have produced the main body of their work in the katha form. This has to do mainly with the economics of writing. In England or America, a writer can hope to survive, and even become wealthy, by writing. But only novels bring in profits, short story collections, like those of poetry, seldom do. In the Indian languages, writers can rarely survive by writing alone. Whether it is novels or short stories, the economics are largely the same, which is to say, negligible. The mode of literary production and the career graph of a writer are different in the West. Observing the credit page in my 1990 collection, Fair Tree of the Void, a British friend noted with some surprise that the stories were written over a period of 15 years. For the professional writer in the West, this would be woefully low output. Yet, if you compare it with the work of a poet, it wouldn't seem so aberrant. These 100 pages of poetry is substantial work for a lifetime. So it may be with the fiction artist. The trouble is, we don't quite think okay fiction as art. Literature used to be counted among the arts, but the novel, from the beginning, has retained an ambivalent character. The novel is part literature and part sociology, which is why it is the favored form for Marxist critics. The novel is commonly a combination of social chronicle and biography. Usually, large chunks of the life history of the central character, S, are narrated over several hundred pages. As a literary form, the USP of the novel is information about social mores, chiefly, but also about different regions and countries, about various professions, and various fields of knowledge, such as history. There used to be a theory of literature as the sugar-coated pill. Today, what the sugar-coated pill makes swallowable is not morality, but information. Lucien Goldman, a Marxist critic, puts it bluntly, in capitalist society, art is merely an inferior form of knowledge. No doubt, the novel is multi-purpose, which is the reason for its survival in an age where information has gone high-tech and the modes of dissemination are numerous and extraordinarily competitive. One purpose that the novel serves is what Freud told us about a long time ago, daydream. Only the cinema can make the novel here. But the mainstay of the novel is still information. This is pretty accurately reflected in the gauging of public taste. There is a bestseller list of fiction, meaning the novel, and that of non-fiction. The two are on par, in fact interchangeable. The two categories fulfill the same need, information. An obvious connecting link is biography, which is acknowledged to be major component of fiction. Biography, especially autobiography, is also a prime subdivision of non-fiction. Non-fiction provides information without the addition of fictional. Time, the short story is celebrated as an evolved art form that makes intellectual demands on the reader. It does not give away its secrets, its meaning, or message immediately. It has to be read like a poem and the meaning teased out through the complex interplay of form and content. According to the writer Vilas Sarang, the short story form has always occupied a preeminent place in Indian literature. We reproduce below a section from his essay, Notes of a Working Writer. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 103. 104 Creative Writing. Embroidery. But in popular perception, there is little difference between the two. A reviewer in Time magazine, 13th September 2004, speaks of the novel becoming a Trojan horse of non-fiction. This reviewer remarks that Amitav Ghosh, the Indian English novelist, is a purveyor of facts about some academic discipline, with the facts being suitably sugar-coated in fiction. The Time reviewer was perhaps unaware that he was using a concept that has its origin in Horace and Lucretius, with only a little change in the terms of reference. So if you see a lot of tourists inspecting churches for hidden clues to the life of Christ, don't be too sure it is under influence of some non-fiction work. It might be a novel. The strength of the novel is length. The law of diminishing return begins to apply the more length stretches, but novelists believe there are other factors which counterbalance it. To achieve length, the novel has to carry a lot of excess baggage, which, anyway, is built into the from as biography and concentration, the critical pressure that most art forms strive for. Edvard Munch, The Scream, is a classic example of critical pressure. So are many lyrics. The short story is more proactive and fastidious on this front, information, Yes, but the most cunningly chose. The short story writer can legitimately aspire to write the perfect story. No novelist hopes to write the perfect novel, but aesthetic appeal is not, or should not, be the supreme goal of the short story. The short stories of Kafka do not seem to care much for aesthetic perfection. Nor do those of the early Hemingway, or of Borges. What these writers focus upon is not beauty of form, but a kind of knowledge. Not the inferior form of knowledge, which Goldman speaks of. Great short story writers offer us a singular vision. The short story gives us knowledge, but not knowledge as information. The short story at its best goes beyond sociology, or biography, or information of any kind. Twisting the words of Aristotle around, we might say that most novels are closer to history than to philosophy. The short story, on the other hand, is apt to become obsessed with pursuing a vision, frequently treating the business of high storytelling with scant regard, at times almost playfully. However, if fiction is to be taken as an art form, it cannot be straightforward philosophy or history, it must transcend these spheres of human understanding. A lot of Indian writers have published accomplished short stories: R.K. Narayan, Salman Rushdie, Rohinton Mistry, Vikram Chandra, Geeta Hariharan, Amit Chaudhary, Jhumpa Lahire, Manju Kapoor, to name only a few. Some novels by contemporary Indian novelists are Times Amit Chaudhary A New World, Times Amitabh Ghosh The Shadow Lines, The Hungry Tide, Times Arundhati Roy The God of Small Things, Times Geeta Hariharan The Thousand Faces of Night, When Dreams Travel, Times Jhumpa Lahiri The Namesake, Times Manju Kapoor Difficult Daughters, Home, Times Rohinton Mystery Such a Long Journey, A Fine Balance, Times Salman Rushdie Midnight's Children, Shame, The Moor's Last Sigh, Times Shashi Tharoor The Great Indian Novel, Times Vikram Chandra Red Earth and Pouring Rain, Times Vikram Seth Golden Gate, A Suitable Boy, and Equal Music. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 pm page 104. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 105. Activity 17. 1. Make a list of 5 novellas. 2. Discuss the difference between the short story and the novel. 3. Amma Hussain was born in Karachi, Pakistan, in 1955 and moved to London in 1970. A graduate of SOS, he has been writing and publishing fiction, reviews and criticism since the mid-80s. His first collection of stories, Mirror to the Sun, was published in 1993, followed by This Other Salt, 1999, Turquoise, 2002, and Cactus Town, Selected Stories, 2003. At present, Aima Hussain is course director of the MA in the National and International Literatures in English at the Institute of English Studies, School of Advanced Studies, University of London. He is also a former convener of the undergraduate creative writing course at the University of Southampton. He lives in London. http://www.english.soton.ac.uk/hussain.htm4 Note on Aima Hussein's new stories, 19th March 1998. http://www.salida.organization.uk/salida/site/. The story, Sweet Rise, is from the collection The Blue Direction and Other Stories, Delhi, Penguin India 1999, by Amma Hussain III, originally published as This Other Salt by Saki Books. Commenting on the collection, Amit Chaudhary observes, to paraphrase Wallace Stevens, it is equal to living in a tragic time to live in a tragic land, and this is the sense one gets from Amma Hussein's stories, on whose fringes lie countries of the mind, Pakistan, India, Indonesia, England. These nations' political histories are drawn subtly into the psychic drama of the narrator's own story of regret, childhood, love, loss, displacement, and wonder. The narrator gropes his way through dark and light, but the stories themselves are wonderfully controlled, written in a tactile and musical prose, and with a very individual sense of beauty. 4. We will try and read Sweet Rise in terms of its characters, plot, point of view, and setting to get an insight into craft. We hope that through this exercise the students will learn to ask similar questions of everything they read. Reading creatively is an essential exercise for all writers. Sweet Rise. For Yasmin Abbasi, who suggested a final, vital ingredient. A few weeks after her 40th birthday, unremembered, unsung, Shireen underwent a brief crisis and then received an unexpected gift. This is how it happened. Jamil, her husband, one of those dedicated bankers who spent his life between his office, his associates, his business trips, and his bed, announced to her one Sunday from the shallows of early morning sleep that he had important people visiting from abroad and other to whom he desperately owed a seasonal invitation. In short, she had to cater for more than a dozen guests at less than a week's notice. The dinner, Shireen grumbled silently as she lowered herself deeper into the depths of Capricornian gloom, was to be next Saturday, and she knew she would have to excel herself, for even her best was never good enough for Jamil's Libran discernment. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 105. 106 Creative Writing. And so it had always been. In this impossibly difficult city of London, where even a powerfully situated husband did not guarantee a work permit or a job for a doctor with a third world, read by the British as third class, degree and experience, her made Eichel expertise so many years, and so much of her widowed mother's savings spent on it had been displaced to an ongoing culinary struggle to keep her husband tied to her table, with sundry colleagues, for deals meant more to him than domesticity, in tow. Such was life. Take Timur, now 7, and growing away from his mother to school, do the shopping at Safeway and Marks and Spencer's on Edgware Road, go the Marylebone Library for some Han Suin books in which other Asian lands far from her own were reflected in a doctor's eyes, come home and desultorily clean up. She would dispensed with the idea of an au pair a while ago, for she needed something besides shop. Pink to fill up the time that reminded her of the globe of her days, which was filling up with sand, taking her further and further away from any chance of regaining her fine hospital job in Karachi, or, indeed, of adding to her qualifications the required British degrees. Jamil had always found some excuse, saying Timur was too little and medical training here expensive, and then he didn't know how long this English stay, sojourn for her and ideal for him, was going to last. If Shireen asked him for what she called a timetable, how long will we be here? When will we go back? My job isn't going to wait forever, you know, he'd respond. Don't be silly, you have to understand the new economics. Professionals like us don't have front doors in one place anymore. She didn't know whether to be insulted at his negation of her profession, or flag-tharried by his inclusion of her in his. And now a Malaysian woman, who would soon become more a friend than a cleaner, came in once a week to do what Jamil called the heavy jobs. Then she would cook for Jamil and his guests as well, for this, too, she insisted upon. But lately he'd suggested they order food from one of the fancy Pakistani lady caterers who were now proliferating in London, because once she would said in irritation that she hadn't been brought up to cook for armies when he sprung a dinner for 6 on her. And now he thought her home cooking wasn't quite fancy enough for his guests, though he thrived on it himself. But she wasn't going to subscribe to his theory of two weights and two measures, more than good enough for him but not for outsiders, and refused even to consider food from elsewhere. This, He claimed, in contradiction to his earlier protests about her elitist disdain for polite feminine values, was due to what he called her LMC upbringing, and once she would seen a poster for an orchestra called LMC and wondered aloud why an orchestra would name itself lower middle class until her friend Yasmin, with whom she was walking down High Street Kensington, shot her in the ribs and said, "No, silly, that's a typically Pakistani term. LMC stands for the London Musicians Collective." One did still laugh with one's friends sometimes. Usually, though, when Jamil wasn't here. And that was more and more often. Then she would follow her daily routine with the addition of a visit or a walk with one of her two close friends, and come home and still persist in cooking, against modern dietary prescriptions, the dishes she loved, like spinach with meat or potatoes, all rich courgettes and aubergines, rich buttery breads and dry, fragrant pea-speckled rice tinted yellow. Since that was the role she would be allotted by life's scene shifters, she would be a housewife with all the perfectionism of her medical training. But all too often she couldn't eat alone, and her friends were occupied with their matrimonial tasks, so she would freeze the food for some day when it rained or snowed. Then, in her favorite armchair, late into the night, she's read and recreate the stories of Han Suin's life among the women of China and Malaya. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 106. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 107. Now, this party. This time most of the expected guests would be associates or prospective clients from Asia Pacific and the Americas. Monday today, Jamil had gone off to Brussels earlier this morning, flying from the city airport, which he found most convenient for flights to Europe. But all too often it was to the Asia Pacific region he went, for that, he said, was where the economy was booming, and other Asians, too, should make sure of their slice of the cake. Though Shireen dreaded his guests, with their wives who looked suspiciously at the clothes she would had sent to her from Pakistan and snooped around her fixtures and fittings, she was determined to prepare something really special, and outdo those society hostesses whose homes he dragged her to every sixth week or so when he was here. She would already run through her repertoire of homely fare, after all, as a medical student and then a practitioner. She would hardly had time to acquire the skills of her family's women, some passive knowledge, some pragmatic tips, and some inherited skills had so far sufficed. But now, with the frustrated and frustrating perfectionism that constantly chilled her bones, she wanted to cross the final boundary and cook one of the feasts she would heard her grandmother describe with such chop-licking ecstasy. Sweet rice. A delicacy remembered from the day she would kept all her Ramzan fasts for the first time. Not the insipid sweet yellow stuff speckled with shaved nuts, but something lush and golden orange, laden with succulent pieces of chicken and ripe with the subtle and suggestive perfume of fruit. Grandmother had made it for her and named it also, in her 8-year-old's arrogance, she would imagine after her. Shireen Pulav. Sweet rice. Shireen's father was from Multan, but her mother's parents, as they would loved to remind her, had come from some town in what were now the United Provinces in northern India. They would settled in Lahore many years before partition, but retained the gentle gestures, the sweet tongues, and the richly aromatic cooking of another era, another land. After 1947, the landholdings that had given them a small revenue and some claim to feudal graces had vanished, and unlike many others, they would never applied for recompense, which would have been a futile endeavor, as those who complained of properties lost were so many and there just didn't seem to be enough to go around. Her grandfather had lived all his life on his physician's earnings, and her father, too, was a doctor. Simple people, who would fallen in a world that continued to respect material manifestations of heritage, but hardly LMC, as Jamil put it. That term, she thought in catty moods, suited him better, And what was worse, his family had the mentality of shopkeepers with new money. But that was the way things were these days in Pakistan. Enough reminiscing for now, she thought as she turned the corner from Seymour Place into York Street, which led her home. Above her, the inverted grey-tin ball of sky. Grandmother was no longer there, and mother had probably long since gotten a recipe of such absurdly luxurious pretensions. Now where could she find it? Hardly any chance of recovering it from the exercise books filled up with recipes her mother had copied out in her arthritic hand, or Shireen had painstakingly translated or transcribed her Urdu, so fluent when she was younger, had grown almost rusty from years of disuse. Medical textbooks in Urdu. Don't make me laugh. They are written in untranslatable gibberish. Then there were the volumes of Madhur Jeffrey cookbooks that Jamil had brought for her, probably as a burdensome hint they would been placed by her on a corridor shelf, proudly forgotten, thought friends had told her the recipes within them were authentic, time-saving and good, the vanity of a good daughter, rich in the dowry of 1,000 recipes tested and proved, forbade her from turning to them. Once upstairs, in the comfortable sitting room of her flat, feet tucked. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 107. 108 Creative Writing. Up beneath her in a favorite pudgy armchair, she swallowed her lumpy, irksome pride, a pile of discarded notebooks beside her. She inspected Jeffrey's tomes as if in search of some obscure remedy in a respected encyclopedia. But to no avail. What would she do? Her goat-like determination refused to allow her to give up. Sweet rice. It would have been a gesture so grand, so uncharacteristically flamboyant, a celebration of her home, and above all a defiant signature, named after her. The sweet rice, the indulgent grandmother had deceitfully said, the indulged child had gullibly believed. What have I ever signed with a flourish? Shireen said to herself. Do I even remember my signature? And this son of mine is his father's child, an English child, who prefers dubiously prepared hamburgers and chips fried in the greasy remains of God knows what forbidden animal to his mother's wholesome cooking. Give him a fresh, sweet lassi and he asks for an artificially flavored yogurt. Then a picture teased her visual memory. She went to the hall cupboard in use this season, as their coats and winter things were stored there, and retrieved a chest in which some ancient objects of sentimental value. Don't look back and above all don't smell or sniff. It only takes you to places surrendered, were stored. She knelt there on the carpet, rummaging, foraging. A red scarf. Two saris. And the bundle of books. They tumbled out Perveen Shakir's first two volumes of verse, the single working woman's inspiration of her twenties. Those novels of A.R. Cartoon that had delighted her between the ages of 12 and 15. Just, pragmatic romances, as a frontier post columnist, Shahnaz Aijuddin, who would recently written about the creative apathy of Western educated Pakistani women, too had described them, in a fulsome tone that amazed her because, as a teenager, she would finally, regretfully relegated them to a corner, submitting to the senior school child's unwritten law of West. Organization which decreed that anything local or ethnic, except the odd piece of mystic music, was suspect, unworthy, LMC, while English was chic and desirable. Then, some romances of Islam and of colonialism and the 57 uprising by Abdul Halim Sharer, whom the Urdu scholars of today considered as dated as Rider Haggard. Here, now, the classic book of recipes she would been searching for. She would taken the bundle of books from her grandmother's cupboard when the old lady died, aged 83, a sentimental gesture, followed by the contradictory, even furtive, action of hiding them. Once she would carted them to London, under piles of gauzy unusable garments behind her husband's sports gear and her son's array of sundry school things. A moth-eaten, mildewed book. The Urdu script was old-fashionedly pure and clear, faint now with time but still legible. On the frontispiece, under the title, The Year of Publication, 1911, Namankana, the book was called, The Traditional Larder. She had never, when she took it away, imagined she would have use for it in these labor-saving days, and even the names, weights and terms in it, as she browsed, were archaic. But after a false and disappointing start, since it wasn't included in the book's list of contents, and she couldn't locate a familiar heading, the recipe appeared. On page 89, orange rice, the author had called it chicken or lamb, rice, clarified butter, onions, coriander, garlic, salt, cumin, black pepper, cloves, cardamom and sugar. And then, for the remembered fragrance, heady, like playing the circle game with your favorite boy cousin in the sun, she had to turn to recipe number 249 on page 192. A sauce of orange peel, almonds, pistachios, cardamoms, water and for the final, special, touch crystallized rock sugar. All ingredients so easy to find nowadays, in this city with no cuisine of its own to boast of, which had, in its usual, grudging and offhand way, taken to guzzling the delicacies of its erstwhile empire and was even developing an increasingly discerning palate for them. Little Asias of restaurants and eating places had taken over the city, the revenge of the Spice Islands, as she and Yasmin jokingly said when they chose. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 pm page 108. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 109. Places to shop and eat. The Rock Sugar, perhaps, would be difficult to locate, but Drummond Street, for a sturdy walker like her, she walked for hours in post-autumnal, leaf-bare Regent's Park sometimes, was only a short walk away, though she hated its dinginess and its staley spicy smells. And if not, then Harrods or Fortnum's would be sure to stock it. In the end, she would have gone even beyond the remembered delight to create something new, something lavish and wonderful, a festive concoction that bore her name. Later, though. For now she had found a companion. Jamil always said, when he saw the increasing pile, in her usually orderly surroundings, of medical digests and newspapers, imported heralds, sheets, and frontier posts, free handouts, big issues, and mail order catalogs she saved because there was always something she wanted to read again, that Shireen would even find something to devour with her eyes on the back of a cereal pack, an airline ticket or a postage stamp. It was a joke, she was sure. He'd picked up from one of the American men's magazines that were his only leisure reading, or from an in-flight journal, this tasteless description of the kind of passionate, indefatigable reader she was. The book would keep her engrossed, amused, transported, for hours. When she reached the last of the recipes, homesickness sometimes is closer than anything to happiness, she still had half an hour before she left to pick up Timur, who she would remembered had football practice after classes today, from his school near Marble Arch. She discovered an index of recipes at the end of the book, no point now regretting that she hadn't located it earlier, for half the fun of finding the recipe for sweet rice had been the search for it. Beyond the index was a list of books published by the same house. She realized that they were all by the author of this book, whom she would imagine as a semi-literate bourgeoise, a turn-of-the-century housewife. Her ignorance astonished her. This woman, Muhammadi Begum, had been the editor of the first influential Urdu journal for women, which her husband had founded in Lahore in 1898. She had written at least a dozen books in the span of just 10 years. Some were guides to housekeeping and good manners, but the titles of others, and the short, pithy blurbs below, made Shireen long for a grand library. A book for children, a young girl seeks a magic fountain, tree and bird to free her brothers, who have turned to stone, from captivity. Will Jamil, to free his limbs one day, from their pervasive torpor. A tale for adolescents, a poor but highly learned young girl works day and night, setting up a school for girls, using her intelligence and wits to pay for her brother's education and her mother's recovery from mental illness. And here I complain, listless. Two novels for adults, one about the evils of forcing an educated young woman interested in the study of medicine and the art of herbalism to marry her incompetent, dissipated cousin, and driving her to despair and death. And what have I done? Jamil was not my cousin, but I didn't love him, and settled for a marriage of convenience because my work didn't give me time and I was afraid and over 30. A biography of a role model, an impoverished widow who would become the principal of a vernacular girls' school in colonial Lahore, well over a century ago. Muhammadi Begum. Who was she then? This master cook who would stir the ingredients of romance and realism into platters of parables that had nurtured generations of women, secluded or newly emergent from the confines of four walls and wells, adding a special prescription for those women who, almost a century later, were doctors and lawyers and opposition leaders and even prime ministers. Dead so the prefaces, written by her stepdaughter and stepdaughter-in-law told Shireen in 1908 at the age of 30, and I am already 40, and still alive, and have abandoned my years of useful training and service to languish and mourn in a luxurious central London. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 109. 110 Creative Writing. Flat, finding time to leave behind this keepsake of herself, this cookery book, the only work for which she was remembered, by a multitude of women who continued to share her bounty. And sharing bread is the closest form of love. Taken from this Namankhana she left behind her. Namankhana. Simply translated, a larder or storehouse. Literally, a house or chamber of bounty. And it was from this chamber of bounty of blessings that Shireen would draw sustenance. She would share what she had, give unstintingly, take what was offered, laid out on the destartan, the fresh white banqueting cloth of life. All the way to Timur's school, she pondered, she brooded, yes, the dish that bore her own name, that she would prepare, but she would do much more. She would go to the India Office library and excavate, reclaim whichever of Muhammadi Begum's writings she could find. She would spend her remaining fallow years in this foreign country recreating a forgotten time from her own past, giving back to this amazing woman of whom no photograph existed since, as a traditional Muslim woman, she had never forsaken her purdah, her purloined history. On her way home, holding Timur's unwilling hand in the bus, like his father, her son didn't like to walk. Shireen paid little attention to the child's customary pampered nonsense. Streams of history flowed in her head. Like Shireen's own father, Muhammadi Begum's husband Mumtaz Ali had encouraged her endeavors. A radical religious scholar, Mumtaz Ali was a fighter for the right of women to choose their own destinies, to emerge into the light of education and the dignity of unveiling, to marry and to divorce whom they chose, to walk and work in the world as men's equals. Recognizing her superior talent, he had set up a press for his youthful bride, published her books, and kept them and her memory alive for many, many years after her death. And will Jamil think of me when I go? Or has living abroad pushed him back into some realm of the colonized, the spineless, who fear the vocal freedom of their equals and partners, as the ruler fears the mocking songs of his subjects? Does this city allow freedom only to those that fill its treasuries with borrowed or stolen pounds? And who will support me if I spend years researching the life of a woman whose potent writings are probably interred, by a trick of history and idle conservation, in the mildewed and mite-infested coffers of empire? Shireen had decided. When she would finally settle Timur in front of one of his interminable Mario games a special favor, On a weekday, she picked up the phone and dialed Yasmin's number. Yasmin's machine switched itself on. Resignedly, Shireen said, "Call me when you can, it's nothing important." "Well, actually, I wondered if you and your husband are free on Saturday for dinner." "My husband's not here," Yasmin's voice interrupted her, "and I'm free all week." "Sorry about the machine. I was avoiding Tahmina. You know how long she goes on. Listen, I'm thinking of compiling a recipe book. You know, based on those recipes from our grandmother's time. I'm thinking of calling it Sweet Rice." Half an hour later, or maybe 2 hours, for she hadn't looked at her watch when she called Yasmin, and they would traverse a century and more in their conversation, she had a collaborator, a fellow conspirator. Yasmin knew of someone who knew a publisher in Pakistan, who may be interested in assisting Shireen in her project of writing about her new heroine's life. With the fashionable status of Asian food in Britain, they would have no major problem in finding an outlet here for sweet rice. The fancy Pakistani lady caterers, once they would wet their coal in streams down their faces, would throng to the spectacular launch, and afterwards claim that the recipes they would copy had originated in their mother's kitchens. And Yasmin had suggested a subtitle. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/20084442 pm page 110. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 111. And a vital ingredient for their bountiful feast, there would be lots of bright illustrations, and between the recipes, to refresh the palate like cool sweet water, they would serve whatever stories they could uncover of the life of Muhammadi Begum, and as condiments they could recount their own experiences of living and cooking at home and in alien lands. Activity 18. 1. What is the apparent reason for Shireen's decision to make sweet rice? What is the other more hidden and compelling reason suggested in the story? 2. The careful reading of the recipe book Naman Khana provides a moment of illumination for Shireen. What does Shireen see when a match is struck unexpectedly in the dark for her in her London flat? 3. Identify the passages that suggest a. Jamil's socio-economic status. B. Jamil's male-centered point of view. C. Limitations of Jamil's world. Character. Characters are things of the past, insists the contemporary French novelist Alain Rob Grillet. Can one write a story without characters? A character is presumably an imagined person who inhabits a story. Exceptions could have rabbits or inanimate objects like the wind as inhabitants. Readers demand consistency from fictional characters and look for reasons in their behavior. E. M. Forster suggested two ways of building characters. A writer may sculpt a round character or sketch a flat character. The former is made up of many personality traits and tends to be complex and both more lifelike and believable, while the latter consists of only a few personality traits and tends to be simple and less believable. Flat characters tend to remain the same throughout the story, round characters usually develop or change. In Sweet Rice, Shireen is a round character, whereas Timur may be described as a flat character. Experimental writers may deliberately use only flat characters. Usually, fiction has both round and flat characters. Major characters are round and minor characters flat as more space is required for round characters. Characters may at times be symbolic, of greed or of a figure like Christ. For example, in John Updike's stories, certain characters are Christ figures making redemption possible, sometimes representative. For example, Jamil may be seen to represent the successful subcontinental banker in Sweet Rice, and at other times historical or biographical, modeled on real people. For example, Muhammadi Begum in Sweet Rice is a historical character. In the 20th century, some fiction writers challenged characterization as practiced in the 19th century. "You mustn't look in my novel for the old stable ego of character," wrote the modernist writer D.H. Lawrence to a friend about the rainbow. And in that novel and other novels, Lawrence demonstrated his view of individuals as bits of one life force, spurred to act by incomprehensible passions, the dark gods in them. James Joyce wrote Finnegan's Wake, allegedly a novel without characters. The Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/20084442 pm page 111. 112 Creative Writing. Protagonist in Franz Kafka's The Castle has no markers, no home, no family, no definite appearance, not even a name, just the initial K. These exceptions only prove the rule that characterization is central to writing fiction. If a writer wants to join the ranks of the novelists mentioned above he too will have to internalize the art of characterization in order to reverse it. Writers need to avoid certain pitfalls in characterization. All of us live in cultures that have certain stereotypes. All Bengalis, according to North Indian stereotyping, love fish and football. If a stereotype creeps unawares into fiction, it would pull the fiction down, making it lifeless. However, if a writer is aware of the stereotype and exploits it as he would be able to infuse life and excitement into the work. Stereotype production is based on times simplification, times exaggeration or distortion, times generalization, times presentation of cultural attributes as being natural. Stereotypes sometimes results in stock characters. A stock character is a fictional character that relies heavily on cultural types or stereotypes for its personality, manner of speech, and other characteristics. Stock characters are instantly recognizable to members of a given culture. Wikipedia. The Small Town Girl and the Socialite are some examples of stock characters in Indian television serials. Gone with the Wind is peopled with stock characters, the loyal black mammy and the wild, rapacious free nigger. In Sweet Rice, from Shireen's description of them, we know immediately what the society hostesses who are coming for dinner would be like. A stock character is likely to be flat and not very lifelike. Activity 19. 1. What do you understand by the term character? Discuss your favorite fictional character. 2. Shireen is the only round character in the story, Sweet Rice. How does she develop and change? List the characteristics that make her lifelike. 3. In spite of being sketched very economically, Yasmine is a memorable character. What role, in your opinion, does she play in the story? 4. What kind of character is Jamil? You may use more than one heading. List his characteristics to support your answers. 5. How does Hussein use exploit the following? Other stereotype of a Pakistani child brought up in England. B. The stereotype of exotic Pakistani women and food. C. The historical character of Muhammadi Begum. D. Shireen's family history. Plot. According to Aristotle's Poetics, plot is the arrangement of incidents. Aristotle also argues that art succeeds when the beginning, middle, and end of an action are clearly and persuasively motivated. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 pm, page 112. Unit 3, Modes of Creative Writing 113. A lot has happened since Aristotle. We already know that many elements of the traditional plot have been deleted or transformed in the contemporary story. An image or an unrelated event may substitute the events of the plot. Metaphoric plot, beginning or middle or end may be dropped. Elliptical plot. Sweet Rice, for instance, has a metaphoric plot. It has two strands running through it. The story of the relationship between Shireen and Jamil and the story of Muhammadi Begum. The two strands are knit together. It may seem that no resolution has been posited for Shireen and Jamil's story. On close reading, it would be clear that the climax, Shireen's discovery of the recipe book Namankhana, doesn't merely usher in the second story but actually paves the way for the protagonist to resolve the impasse, conflict, or problem of the first story. Shireen decides to empower herself with the history of her admirable ancestress by reading the recipe book Sweet Rice. Some modernist or postmodernist fiction writers would be impatient with the very concept of plot, preferring to drift along with the consciousness of their characters. So we will limit our definition of plot to the series of events which form the story of a novel, play, film/movie, etc. Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary. The following have been suggested as elements of plot. 1. Initial situation, the beginning. It is the first incident that makes the story move. 2. Conflict or problem, goal which the main character of the story has to achieve. 3. Complication, obstacles which the main character has to overcome. 4. Climax, highest point of interest of the story. 5. Suspense, point of tension. It arouses the interest of the readers. 6. Denouement or resolution, What happens to the character after overcoming all obstacles, failing to achieve the desired result, and not reaching his goal? 7. Conclusion, the end of the story. However, one the other element may be dropped, transformed, or substituted in the story. Aspiring writers often ask the question, where should I start? Do I need a plot? A plot occurs when a character encounters circumstances which threaten their rhythm of living, a loss, a meeting, a sudden break of routine. Mills 1996. Events in Sweet Rise take place when Shireen, the main character, decides to go against her husband's advice of calling in a Pakistani caterer and resolves to prepare a dish that bears her own defiant signature. This way of looking at a plot assumes that characters precede the plot. Plot is sometimes explained as the pencil outline that guides the painter's brush. It is assumed here that writers begin writing fiction with a plot. According to this view, Sweet Rice came about when Ahmad Hussain thought of writing about the empowerment of a Pakistani woman who has had to relinquish her medical practice due to the demands of her family. We do not whether plot precedes characters, and perhaps we don't need to. A creative writing course cannot and should not prescribe what a writer should start with. Although in the workshops we will suggest some ideas that might help. Some writers feel more confident working with an outline, others like to begin with a face, an expressed sign or an incident. In all cases, the story should take over very quickly, and various ingredients of the fiction, i.e., character, plot, setting, point of view, begin to work together in harmony. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 113. 114 Creative Writing. How, at which point, and if at all, employment is to take place is a decision every writer needs to make independently for every work. Activity 20. 1. What do you understand by the term plot? 2. If we take the initial situation in Sweet Rise as Jamil's announcement of a dinner party on Saturday, what would constitute the subsequent elements? Conflict, complication, climax, suspense, denouement, and conclusion. 3. Discuss Shireen and Jamil's story in terms of beginning, middle, and end. Would you say the events follow logically one from the other, or are there gaps that the reader is supposed to fill in? 4. Describe Muhammadi Begum's story. What relevance does it have for Shireen? 5. Rewrite the last 4 paragraphs of the story, giving it another ending. Begin changing the story from the line, Shireen has decided. Point of view, modes of narration. A very important question we need to ask when we are reading or writing a story is, who is the narrator? It is rare in modern fiction for a writer to step out from behind the computer and tell the story. We must not confuse the narrator with the author. The narrator is the entity within a story that tells the story to the reader. It is one of 3 entities responsible for storytelling of any kind. The others are the author and the reader, or audience. The author and the reader both inhabit the real world. It is the author's function to create the alternate world, people, and events within the story. It is the reader's function to understand and interpret the story. The narrator exists within the world of the story, and only there, and presents it in a way the reader can comprehend it. Stories may be narrated in the first person, I, but usually the I is a major or minor character in the story, and not the author. For example, Truman Capote's Breakfast at Tiffany's, where an unnamed character tells the story of Holly Golightly, who he used to know some 15 years ago. Stories may also be narrated in the third person. In this case, the narrator would be one of the following: 1. All-knowing or omniscient. For example, Jane Austen's novels, where characters are described with irony. 2. Seeing into one major character. For example, Sweet Rice. 3. Seeing into one minor character. For example, Madame Bovary, when she is described from the perspective of Charles Bovary, who she later marries. 4. Objective, not seeing into any characters. For example, mystery novels or stories are sometimes written in this way, where the narrator observes, eavesdrops, and reports. As we know from our earlier discussion, limitation of point of view is an important feature of the modern short story and novel. The omniscient narrator is an exception rather than the rule these days. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 114. Unit 3 Modes of Creative Writing 115. In Sweet Rice, we see that the point of view remains fixed and the narrator follows the thought process of only the protagonist, Shireen. He does not tell us about what is going on in Jamil or Timur's head but gives enough information about them to enable us to come to our own conclusions. The narrator is neither Shireen nor Aima Hussain. He is a fictional construct that inhabits only Sweet Rice. Limitation of point of view works well in Sweet Rice. We see Jamil the banker through his wife's eyes and hear his borrowed ideas and words through her consciousness. Hamburger and chips and artificially flavored yogurt have also claimed Timur the son, we are told. Shireen's point of view forces us to reinterpret Jamil's idyll, the age of the booming new economy. It also makes us see Muhammadi Begum, who spent her short life in Parda, in a new light. Activity 21. 1. Describe a short story/novel that you have read that has an omniscient narrator. 2. How would the story, Sweet Rice, change if the narrator were to be omniscient and also express Jamil's point of view? 3. Rewrite the first page of the story in the first person from Yasmine's point of view. Remember, Yasmine is a close friend of Shireen. She is more aware of the difference between Pakistani English and London English. She is also the one who suggests the vital ingredient for Sweet Rice, asking Shireen to include in her proposed book the historical and present-day culinary experiences of women at home and abroad. Setting, milieu. Setting in literature is the time, place, locale, and sometimes the weather in the story. Setting is not merely the backdrop to the action. In effective stories it plays a symbolic or even an active role. Writers take great care to choose the appropriate setting for their stories. The hour, the day, the year, and the century have to be kept in mind whether one is writing a historical piece or a contemporary one. The passage of time in fiction also has to be monitored. Effective stories can be written about an hour, a day, a year, or several centuries. Similarly, writers research or explore the place they are writing about. Some writers who focus on a particular geographical area repeatedly are called regional writers. Thomas Hardy is one example. William Faulkner, who set all his work in his native Mississippi, is another good example. Through their writings they make the place come alive to the readers. At times the weather, snow, storm, wind, or the heat are also important constituents of fiction. Some writers depict characters as products of heredity and environment and even as helpless puppets in the hands of these factors. Such fiction is classified under naturalism or fiction of grim realism. Theodore Dreiser and Thomas Hardy are examples of writers of naturalistic novels. There are also writers who deliberately eschew setting in order to give a fable-like effect to the story. In Somerset Maugham's The Appointment in Samara, details of the marketplace in Baghdad are avoided to focus on death, that is the main point of the story. Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2008 p.m. page 115. 116 Creative Writing. Sweet Rice is set in London. The texture of Shireen's life unfolds in her daily routine of dropping and picking up Timur, shopping at Safeway and Marks and Spencer's, and cleaning and cooking in her York Street flat. Her misreading of a poster for an orchestra called LMC suggests an emotional distance from her surroundings. London also embodies the erstwhile empire. Her reality, Shireen feels, is interred in the India Office Library as a relic of colonialism. She resolves to look for it in the history of Muhammadi Begum. Thus, the India Office is much more than a mere place name in the story. Activity 22. 1. What role does setting play in a short story? 2. What is the duration of the events in Sweet Rice? 3. Identify portions where Shireen personifies London, attributing motivation and agency to the city. 4. Do you think the same story could have been set in Lahore or Karachi? Give reasons for your answer. 5. Rewrite the fourth paragraph of the story, setting it in another foreign city. Begin changing it from the line, "Such was life." You will need to find out the names of streets, the mode of public transport, names of public buildings, etc. of your chosen location. A conversation with a creative writer. Anuradha Merwa. Anuradha Merwar, one of the authors of this book, has published 3 novels. The Higher Education of Geetika Mehandiratta published by Disha Books, Delhi in 1992. Idle Love published by Ravidayal Publisher in 1999 and Dirty Picture published by Indielog in 2007. We reproduce below her replies to our questionnaire. When did you begin writing and which forms did you experiment with? I can't remember a time when I was not writing. As a child, I used to fill notebooks and diaries with poems. I graduated to writing fiction at 26 when I realized I was not a poet. I have tried my hand at short stories, drama, and screenplay as well, but my primary form is the novel. What drew you towards the novel? The realization that I was not writing poetry seriously enough. It came too easily. I suppose my poems were facile. Whatever one writes should be from the gut. The novel form provided the scope to me to use all of myself. Would you say that certain forms lend themselves to the expression of certain themes? Definitely. Form should go hand in hand with content. For me, poetry is primarily aesthetic, it needs a light touch even if there is protest. I used poetry in Idle Love, but I couldn't have written the novel as a poem. For one, I needed a lot more space. The dystopic sensibility of the narrator of that novel could find full expression only in a combination of descriptions, ruminations, and dialogue. Drama too is different from prose fiction. I am reminded of what John Fowles said comparing films and novels. The novel is much better adapted to moral and psychological discrimination. Later on, predictably, he was disappointed with the film version of Unit 03B, Creative Writing 728/2084.
Ever, children's literature should not be literature of despair. The Sword of Dara Shuko deals with betrayal and greed, but it also affirms goodness. To the extent that the valuable sword becomes the property of the children who found it. A conversation with a creative writer. Subhadra Sen Gupta. Jaideep Krishnan, our research associate, met the writer of The Sword of Dara Shuko, Subhadra Sen Gupta, and asked her a few questions. We reproduce below some of things she said. Is action the difference between writing for adults and for children? Yes. Children are impatient readers. You have to move into action very quickly. Plot is absolutely important. You have to talk to them straight, not speak down to them. Do not ever give advice, they hate it. What kids like is a lot of detail, a lot of descriptions. What is the color, the smell, the touch? It is very important to them. I incorporate a lot of this, especially as I'm talking of the past. Sights, sounds, smell, everything gets in. Is an oral style important? Yes, you have to write it in an oral way. I always imagine a child to whom I tell the story. Makes the process better, easier. What kind of stories do children prefer? Children prefer stories if they are connected to familiar things, for example, nowadays computers are very common, so they could connect to one of my stories about a ghost in a computer. Although my stuff is not always about familiar things, it is usually about palanquins and swords. I mean, I keep up with kids, and I can write about what is familiar to them like iPods. What about morals? It is not that I don't bring up questions, I do. Always sugar-coated within a good plot, so they read it anyway. Evil of every kind appears, and so does goodness, but I do not preach, that makes kids puke. I also weave in things like tolerance and equality, but I do it very lightly. The protagonists always belong to different religions. They are often poor. People expect historical fiction to be about nawabs and princesses, so I have children of Tongawalas and Sabjawalas going out and solving mysteries. This is also to break the cliched belief many middle-class kids have that poor kids are dumb. While writing for kids, you are always conscious of the fact that you can influence them much deeper than you would an adult. That's what I enjoy, playing with their devious little minds. Should certain topics, like rape, violence, be avoided when writing for children? I have been thinking about this for a long time. But I don't think I am capable of handling it, at least for preteens. I hear a lot from children about peer pressure, divorced parents, physical/mental abuse. All these things need to be talked about. It is very necessary. But for me, it is very difficult to talk about these things. It is difficult to write about them. I've been thinking about it for some time. If I deal with it, it will have to be in the first person, because the point of view decides how the story comes across. Evil should be incorporated, makes for great plots. It doesn't shock kids. But I prefer an upbeat ending. Tell us about how you work. Do you think feedback to work in progress is important? I start early and work till about lunch. You can't say, I'll wait for inspiration. You just have to write. The hardest part is to start writing. Unit 03B, Creative Writing, July 28, 2008, 4:42 p.m. Page 131. 132 Creative Writing. Activity 23. 1. Make a list of 10 Indian books for children and specify which age group each is intended for. 2. Write about your favorite book as a child of 12. Why do you think you liked it so much? 3. On the basis of the material provided above, write a paragraph about the difference between writing for children and adults. Research is essential. Even for modern stories, it gives them texture. Doing a story about 3 anonymous kids and a dog in an anonymous town doesn't work. It is important to write. It is also important to get the stories read. You need to know if it works. The feedback is important. Sometimes the criticism can really destroy you, but it has to be done, and the more you write, the sharper it gets. You have written a lot of stories which are set in the past. Having a niche like history helps. The publisher needs to be convinced. Create a person. Would you like to play God? For the next 2 class periods, we will encourage you to create a human being based on someone you know, in your own image, or completely imaginary. In the first workshop, we ask you a series of questions that will help you form an image of the person in your mind. In the second workshop, some of you may read out your answers to the class and answer questions that come from your classmates. The good news is that the teacher is not allowed to express an opinion. Workshop 4. Let's create a person. Answer the following questions without discussing them with anyone. 1. What is the name of the person? 2. How tall is she, he? 3. How old? 4. Hair, long or short, straight or curly. 5. Color of eyes. 6. Does he work? What does he do for a living? 7. Is or was he married? If yes, describe the spouse in 2 lines. If not, give the REA son in 2 lines. 8. Does or did he have a lover? If yes, describe the lover. If not, give the reason in 2 lines. 9. Does he have friends? Describe her / his closest friend in 2 lines, or tell us the reason for her / his isolation. 10. What is her / his strongest desire? What does she / he hope / long / pray for? Unit 03B, Creative Writing, July 28, 2008, 4:42 p.m. page 132. Unit 3, Modes of Creative Writing, 133. 11. Describe a dream he had last night in 2 lines. 12. Does he have an enemy? Why / why not? 13. In 2 lines, describe a childhood incident that made a lasting impression on her / him. 14. Describe in 2 lines an accident he had as an adult. Note, if the person is a child, leave out questions 6, 7, 8, and 14. Replace with 1. Does / he go to school? If yes, describe the school. If not, give the reason in 2 lines. 2. Describe her / his parents in 2 lines. 3. Describe her / his class teacher or any other adult / he comes in daily contact with. 4. Describe the most frightening incident of his / her life. After you finish, tear out the page and hand it over to your teacher. You will get it back. Note to the teacher: please go over the answers the students have provided and select 4 sheets for classroom discussion. Workshop 5 Tutorial Format. Discussing the person 1. The student reads out the questions and the answers. 2. The answers are open for discussion. However, the student who wrote the answers has to be silent until allowed to speak. The teacher, too, is not allowed to speak. 3. The discussion focuses on the following points: A. Appearance of the person. B. The kind of relationship he has. Is there a pattern to the relationships? C. Is the person ambitious? What kind of problems he might have in attaining the goals? D. The kind of life he is leading. 4. Defend the creation. The house puts questions to the writer of the answers. The writer explains her / his point of view. The teacher is silent. Asterisk note to the teacher: the minimum time for discussion of 4 sheets is 55 minutes, 1 period. You may include more sheets for discussion and extend the time of the workshop or have it over 2 to 3 days, depending on the response of the students and your convenience. Please do not return the sheets to the students till the end of Workshop 5. Workshop 6. The person interrupted. Imagine a situation in which the person you created does one of the following. A. Meets a very unusual man / woman. B. Gets a job abroad or has to move out of town. C. Overhears a conversation that stuns and shocks her/him. Unit 03B, Creative Writing, July 28, 2008, 4:42 p.m. Page 133. 134 Creative Writing. If your person is a child substitute with A. Meets a very unusual girl/boy. B. Has to leave town because the parents are transferred. C. Overhears classmates planning something that would shock parents and teachers. Write up this situation in 500 words, focusing on A. The feelings of the person. B. The place and time. C. The events as they take place. Workshop 7, optional. Discussion of the situation constructed in Workshop 6 using the same format as Workshop 5. It would be possible to discuss 2 to 3 situations in a 55-minute class period. Homework for the portfolio. At the end of Workshop 6/7 you may have an idea for a short story. If you do, A. Keep away your worksheets. B. Begin on a fresh page. C. Try not to use any of the phrases and sentences that you have used in your worksheets. D. Let the ideas you have come up with simmer at the back of your mind while you write. At the end of Workshop 3/4 you may feel that your person and the situation are not working. In that case, A. Keep away the worksheets. B. Begin on a fresh page. C. Avoid everything you wrote and thought in Workshop 1, 2, 3, and 4. Both the outcomes are equally valuable. Section 3, Drama. What is drama? The concept and characteristics of drama. All of us have constructed plays at some point or the other. As children, we played doctor-patient, teacher-student, or robber-police, and so on. We imagine ourselves with a completely different identity. We place